We all know what Resident Evil is. It's that bizarre and incomprehensible video game franchise that came from Japan and is one of the most popular video game franchises in the world. Starting in 1996, there are currently 10 games in the main canon, 15 spin-offs, and 6 remasters or just out-and-out remakes, with another slated for this year. The series has had its ups and its downs, but we're not here to talk about the games, we're here to talk about the movies. Spanning 6 films from 2002 to 2017, the equally perplexing series holds the honour of being one of the most successful video game adaptations, with the combined box office revenue grossing $1.2 billion worldwide. That's right, $1.2 billion. Rest assured, I'm speaking to you as a fan of both the games and the movies, but I honestly couldn't tell you why. When I think about why I like the franchise, I can't think of a valid reason. It could be because it's zombies and everybody likes zombies, but it can't just be that. There's got to be something else. Well, in this series, I will go through all 6 movies, one at a time. We'll go into how they were made, the actors portraying the famous characters from the games, the monsters they recreated, the significant continuity errors.
You mean my blood is the cure for all this?
Correct. An attempt to get into the mind of the man who made the films happen, and try to understand what he was going for, so we can collectively figure out why the Resident Evil films were so popular. Again, I'm speaking as a fan. Is everybody ready? Here we go.
Let's go!
You're all going to die down here.
Evil is rising.
There's no way I'm going down there.
The terror is spreading, and our chance for survival is running out. Resident Evil.
German production company Constantin Films bought the film rights to the Resident Evil franchise in 1997, and firstly, Alan B. McElroy was hired to write the script. Horror fans will know that name because McElroy is the man who wrote the script for Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers, one of the better films of that particular franchise. McElroy's script was close in concept to the first game. Although Umbrella and Stars are never mentioned, all the characters from the game are present and the plot largely followed that of the game. However, close to the game was not what Constantin wanted, so McElroy's script was rejected. After that first disappointment, well-known zombie enthusiast George A. Romero also had a crack at a shooting script. Romero was familiar with the franchise as he just directed a commercial for Resident Evil 2. However, the draft that he turned in was not what was expected. This is a still photo from an interview that Romero did with Fangoria magazine. It's a little bit hard to read, so I've picked out the relevant bits. This is what Romero said about Constantin's rejection of his script. "They just didn't like my script, man. The company that had it was a German outfit called Constantin Film. They'd bought the game, but I don't think they knew what it was. The executive I worked with was a young guy who was turned onto it, but the head of the company just did not understand it, doesn't even know what a video game is. He wanted it to be something different. I mean, this is the guy who made Das Boot, so he wanted something prestigious. I told him that's not the spirit of the game. I did 5 or 6 drafts, but he just said, forget it. And that was it." Also featured in the same article was a brief plot summary of Romero's script. Romero's story was set in a small town that is evacuated after the accidental spill of a top-secret government-created biological weapon. As contaminated people start popping up as zombies, a crack paramilitary team is sent in to clean up the mess. They head for the source of the contamination, a Xanadu-like forest mansion that houses a government research station, but human ghouls aren't the only thing waiting for them. In their descent into the bowels of the research station, they have to fight, shoot, and slaughter their way through zombie dogs, sharks, and snakes. The deeper they go, the more outrageous their adversaries become, including human-animal hybrid killing machines. Producer Robert Colzer also did an interview with Fangoria, and he stated that Romero's script was not filmed because it was an X-rated draft and therefore would have only been available to a very limited audience and wouldn't have made any money. Soon after Romero was removed from the project, Constantin considered abandoning the project entirely, until this man, Paul W.S. Anderson, came to their attention. Anderson was no stranger to video game adaptations, since in 1995 he directed Mortal Kombat, which became one of the first commercially successful video game adaptations.
Made a movie called Mortal Kombat, and after that film opened at #1 in America, I got offered a lot of other adaptations of video games.
In the late 2000s, Anderson was announced as the writer and director of Resident Evil. Casting sessions took place in both the UK and US, where Michelle Rodriguez, Colin Salmon, Pasquale Aliardi, and Martin Cruz were cast as the team sent in to investigate the Hive. Other cast members portraying main characters included James Purefoy and Eric Mabius. The role of Matt Addison was originally meant to go to David Boreanaz. However, he was forced to turn down the role due to commitments with his TV show, Angel. He was still in negotiations for a smaller role, but that never came to pass. And of course, the main role of Alice went to Ukrainian model and actress Mila Jovovich. I think she's also a singer. Jovovich has stated that she accepted the role because she and her brother were fans of the game. Alice would become a fan favourite, and also the only character to appear in all 6 movies. So how is this film different from the game? In many ways, in fact. Anderson himself stated that he would not follow too closely to the story of the game. But what did that mean?
The first game has a set of characters, and then the sequel actually follows a completely different set of characters in a different location. You know, they're not in a mansion in the woods anymore, they're in a nearby city, Raccoon City, which is all abandoned. When you look at all the games taken together, you know, it was a really wide range of characters in different locations following different storylines. And that kind of made an adaptation extra challenging because, you know, if you go and do an adaptation of Resident Evil 1, you risk alienating all the people who love Resident Evil 2 and the characters from Resident Evil 2. So if you're watching a straight adaptation of Resident Evil 1, the game, there's no suspense. You know who's going to live, who's going to die, you know what the story is. And I felt that would make a very unsatisfying adaptation because why not just go and play the game again? The idea I came up with was to do a prequel. In the very first game, you go into the woods and there's a mansion, and below it is a high-tech research facility. And it's all overrun with undead and mutants and creatures, but it's never really explained what's happened. You know, the backstory to that is never really explained. And that's what the movie does, is the movie kind of is the lead-up, is the prequel to the very first game.
So to sum up, Umbrella is still a thing. The film takes place in an underground lab beneath a mansion which has been overrun with creatures from the games, namely zombie dogs, lickers, and of course, zombies. There are quite a few of those stumbling around, and all of this is possible because of the T-virus. The characters, as established in the previous section, are totally different from the game. Absolutely no canonical characters in the first film. Which is fine. There's no point in telling the story of characters that has already been told. I can see what Anderson was going for. Telling the story of new characters in an already established universe isn't a terrible concept. Fans will already be drawn to the film because of the name and the subject matter, and will get to see the universe through the eyes of new characters. By the time the film came out, there had already been 4 main games in the original canon, and so there were a lot of characters to cover. And which plot do you choose? Having a new cast would have kept things simpler from a story writing perspective. It means that sticking to the plot of the first game isn't strictly necessary, and whilst the monsters would remain faithful, this was a new venture, fresh and ready to be absorbed. I'm not hating this so far. Let's take a deeper look at the plot. The first sequence of Resident Evil shows the scientists and researchers of the Hive going about their daily business until a virus that has been created at the facility, the T-virus, is released into the air conditioning, forcing the facility's AI, the Red Queen, to seal the Hive, meaning everyone inside dies. Meanwhile, Alice, we don't find out her name until the end credits, wakes up in a mansion with no memory of her own identity or how she got there. That's right. It's one of those waking up with no memory plots, which is the bargain basement instant intrigue without trying plots. Alice's background is only briefly explained in this film, but her whole origins will not be revealed until the final film. But we're not there yet. In brief, Alice finds out through the course of the film that she was head of security at the Hive and was plotting with Matt's sister to bring down the Umbrella Corporation by allowing her to enter as an employee and gather evidence of all the illegal stuff that Umbrella was conducting. Then there's James Purefoy's character, Spence, although we don't find out his name until the end. Spence also works for Umbrella and presumably with Alice, and the two are married, but the marriage isn't real, it's just to maintain cover. I'm not sure what they could be covering, since they presumably live in the mansion, since Alice keeps her guns in the dresser, and the only people they interact with will be workers from the Hive who won't give a shit. Anyway, Spence remembers at a totally inconvenient time that he is the bad guy and in fact the one who released the virus. He's stolen samples of both the T-virus and the antivirus to sell on the black market, but Alice had no knowledge of this, since he left a note using a pen that changes the user's handwriting over time. Like I say, Alice and her role in the plot is not revealed until near the end, but she still retains her fighting abilities and reflexes, all the while not knowing who she is. So Alice remembers stuff involving Matt's sister, meaning that she's had a whole career with Umbrella, and an albeit brief history with Spence. Keep that in mind, that's important for later. In fact, for the first hour, you could be forgiven for thinking that Alice is not the main character. She doesn't bloody do anything. She wakes up in the mansion, she gets dressed, she wanders around the mansion, then she's taken down to the Hive, and even then she mostly wanders around in the background and stays totally silent. Then she wanders around the Hive, and then fights some zombies, and then kicks a dog in the face, all while she's wandering around of course, and then she becomes the main protector for the last act of the film. Instead, I would say that the film puts Rain forward in the main character spot, and she seems to be displaying more character. She's the sassy, tough chick who doesn't take anything from anyone. She's also a little bit sweet and flirty with JD, and who can blame her? He's gorgeous. She's also really sad when he dies, and I was sad when he died, because she tried to save him but ended up getting bitten in the process, and JD came back as a zombie and then bit her again. But Rain had already been bitten, and this is where I feel the film got it right. One thing that was left a little bit ambiguous in the games is the T-virus's effect on the body from bite to death. If you're on the lookout, the player might find some photographs showing the effects and symptoms of infection, but largely it's left up to the imagination. All that matters is that the infected are zombies. That changed with the first film. Rain is bitten by a zombie scientist 39 minutes in, and the next 47 minutes until she dies, and then dies again, shows the gradual deterioration of her body. The Red Queen explains how the virus is transmitted, but not the effects, and that was the right decision. We can plainly see the effects on Rain. In all future films, if a character is bitten, their infection is not dwelled upon because we've already seen what the T-virus can do. One sequence that became a staple of the films, and then the games, was the laser room, which is where most of the fatalities take place. In the sequence, a group of commandos, led by one, tread cautiously through a suspicious hallway to reach the Red Queen's mainframe so they can shut her down, but when they're all in a convenient position, the Red Queen seals the doors and activates the weapon system, which is of course, a laser. Whilst Kaplan is outside trying to deactivate the laser, the commandos inside try and survive, and that goes about as well as you'd expect. The medic is decapitated, this guy is cut in half, this guy loses his fingers and presumably dies from shock, whilst one gets the most visually impressive death.
I mean, they're going to cut me up. They're going to slice me. Pulled me onto the floor in a bag. The little bag, I'm surprised.
In a move which the Red Queen could have pulled instantly and wiped them all out in one go, the laser turns into a grid and dices one into several pieces. And finally, there's the big bad. The Licker, a creature that is part digital and part gigantic puppet. Presumably because so much effort and therefore money went into making it, that's why we didn't see a lot of it until the end fight sequence on the train. Let's talk about the ending. In the theatrical version that we're all familiar with, Alice and Matt escape the Hive, but Matt begins to mutate, having been scratched by the Licker. Then they're both seized by Umbrella scientists and taken away. As we find out later, Alice is infected with the T-virus and then wakes up sometime later in an Umbrella facility. She escapes the facility and steps outside to find that Raccoon City has been infested with zombies. Alone, Alice prepares to survive. When I first saw this ending, I thought it was perfectly satisfactory. In one of the original endings, Alice and Matt were captured by Umbrella, but they wake up together. They leave the facility and find that the T-virus has not just infested Raccoon City, but the entire United States. The film ends with Alice and Matt driving to New York, which was where the sequel would take place. This ending was not filmed. But another ending was.
I pretty much had the ending of the film as it was released, but when it got closer to the shoot, there were two things that kind of weighed against that ending. One was a budget issue. It was deemed too expensive to shoot, to have this big devastated city. And the other was, it was felt that it would be too depressing to kind of see the city overrun with the undead. So I wrote and we shot a completely different ending, which is a more up ending, which is 6 months after the incident at the Hive. You know, Mila's now wearing a different costume and she's become this kind of kick-ass Avenger who's hunting down the Umbrella Corporation, looking for Matt, who's been taken off mutating. And she's gone looking for him and she walks into Umbrella headquarters.
It's been 6 months since the Hive. I got out, but Matt didn't. I know that they're still holding him, experimenting, studying him. I've never given up. I've never stopped looking.
Can I help you?
I hope so.
And the idea was we'd have this rocket shoot at camera and then kind of freeze, and then the front of the rocket would just split apart. And you'd see lots of mini rockets inside, like smart rockets, that would each go for an individual target. And then suddenly we go back into real time and the rockets would go and like nail each of these guys. So it was quite a cool ending, but it was smaller. And it was definitely more up because, you know, it was a very action-y ending and she was kicking ass. But you know what, we looked at it and it just never felt right. You know, it just tied everything up too neatly. It felt like action was starting and what you really wanted to see was like a big fight or something, but then suddenly the movie was stopping. And I think, you know, when you write scripts, you know, you write an ending for a reason, you know, it feels right. And, you know, this happens quite often, is you go and you change it and then eventually, doesn't matter what you change it to, it never feels right and you go back to what you originally had, and that's what we did.
I agree with Anderson. The theatrical ending was better. I don't think it was depressing, but rather a natural progression. I think it was a given that if the series continued, it would follow the story progression of the games, which had already had Raccoon City fall to the undead. This ending also nicely sets up the sequel, which I don't feel the alternative ending would have. Released on March 21st, 2002 in Germany and July 12th, 2002 in the UK, Resident Evil made just over $40 million domestically and almost $103 million worldwide, which is massively impressive for a film with a production budget of $33 million. To me, the cast and crew went to great lengths to recreate the feel of the first game. New characters in a claustrophobic environment with hostile enemies and few means to defend themselves, having to survive on their wits. Elements such as the constant opening of doors and even certain camera angles were used to mirror the game. Yes, the dialogue was abysmal, and yes, the characters were about as well-rounded as you'd expect for something with Resident Evil in the title, but for a film adaptation of a video game whose only redeeming feature was the gameplay, it wasn't bad. It definitely had a certain charm to it, and whilst they were held back with budget limitations, I thought they did a good job with what they had. Am I making excuses? Probably. But rest assured, all the positive things done by the filmmakers will have been forgotten for every future installment. That's when the real fun begins.
What the fuck are you talking about?
And now for the obligatory plug my other projects section. Please check out my other channel, which is a gaming channel, where you can watch me play video games without having the pleasure of playing them yourself. Or perhaps my website, where I review various TV shows and movies. I'm also a writer. My book is on Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all soon.